Okay guys, welcome back. It is the digital portrait drawing course. We are now in lesson 10, where we will turn to the side and discuss how to develop a profile portrait. Now before we begin with the profile, I just wanted to quickly go through and show the finished touches that I did on the front view. Now these were just some very small ones that they weren't really worthy of a lesson into themselves because it's stuff that we've already covered previously. It's mostly just noticing the shapes and defining them with shading, especially on the ear. The thing to realize about the ear is that it does contain some more of those hidden lines or those invisible lines that are more indicated than they are illustrated. And then there's several folds of skin. You really just have to study the reference photos to get a good sense of that. The ear is not too much of a challenge, but if you're not careful about it and you don't put some detail and work into it, it can end up looking kind of strange. Even if it's right, it looks kind of strange because ears they're strange anyway. But that's how the ear was done. Then I also added the chin and the neck. That's mostly just shading there. The only difference is on the very edge of the chin. I did go through and use the eraser to outline that and create a sharp highlight, just sort of a rim edge light to separate it visually from the deep shading of the neck. Alright, I also want to point out that at this point of the portrait, a lot of times I'll save this as a construction type of portrait. This serves as the construction file, and then I will actually flatten the individual groups. And what that does is allow a little more adaptability if I want to go in and make sort of global changes, because things are then separated out into maybe half a dozen layers instead of 20, and that does make it easier if I wanted to adjust, say, the overall shading of the piece or something like that. But there we are. Let's go ahead and say goodbye to our front view portrait and move on. So here we have our new sketch paper file, and I have a side head view layered over it. I retrieved this from those side reference images that I provided earlier. I'm going to set this to multiply and decrease the opacity, just like that. Now I'm going to create a new layer, and using the rectangular marquee tool, I'm going to hold down the shift key so I create a perfectly square selection. And as I'm doing this, I'm then going to hold down the space bar while the shift is still down, and that lets me slide it around, and I'm going to line it up with the top and the left of this skull image here, and then release the space bar and continue it out until it reaches the back of the head and the chin at the same time there. Okay, so this is going to serve as our initial measuring stick. And to do this, let's go ahead and hit Alt backspace to fill this in, cancel the selection. Now here's a great little tip on a quick way to generate the midpoints of a square like this. You grab that move tool and hit the show transform controls, and you see the transformation defines the midpoints of that. So I'm turning my rulers on, and I'm going to go ahead and just drop down several guidelines that snap right into place along each of those edges. Okay, now I'm creating a new layer. This is just for my own personal guides. Grab my brush tool again. And once more, I'm going to use a blue color just to help create my guides. So I've got my square drawn out according to those guides that I used before, and after that I'm going to bisect it into quarters. Okay, so now that I've got my 4 quarters, I'm going to further subdivide this into quarters within this side and quarters on the bottom here, and then just halves over on this bottom area and this bottom line here. So first let's start with this side over here to separate each quadrant into further quarters. Okay, so now we have our top 4 quarters, our bottom 4 quarters, and then I want to separate these bottom 2 quadrants into halves on the lower line. So right about here, and then over there. So now we have our quadrant that's all separated out, and I'm going to show you exactly what this helps us for, because let's create a new layer, and this is just going to be the rough in. Grab my trusty HB pencil, and we just roughly sketch in where the top brow meets this vertical line over here, which also is where the chin meets this line over here. They both meet on the same line, and the chin will actually drop down a little bit from this lower horizontal, and the nose extends out. The length of the nose is variable. It depends on the person. Now, the overall width from this little indent here to the edge out here is again generally about the length of an eye, but not always, because people are so different when it does come to the size of their nose. So let's continue on from there. Okay, the eye is on this same central horizontal that we've used before. The tip of the nose is in line with this top quarter line here, and then dips in and slopes back out to meet the top of the lip, which is about where this half line is. And the bottom quarter line is where the top of the chin, that sort of ball area of the chin, it turns around. It changes from going in to out when you're coming down, because that little divot underneath the lips, and then it comes back out right about there. Now the half line over here is about where the chin meets this horizontal line again as it continues on up, and it will follow the jaw line on up throughout the skull there. So we trace along that shape to the back of the skull as it comes down along over here. All right, the neck will meet this lower horizontal at about this halfway point, and it doesn't come straight down. It does slope out gently, well, depending on the position of the body, but it's very unlikely that it will come straight down as a post like that. It will slope out. Also, on this side here, that's where the jawline is meeting that lower horizontal. You begin to see this portion of the neck sloping down too. It's where the neck is coming in to meet the bottom part of the chin. Okay, so now we have the eyebrows that are brought in. That's along this lower quarter of the top fourth. The ear will align like we discussed before. The top of the ear should align with the top of the eye. So the eye socket that's up here should align with the top of the ear. Where the lobe connects to the skull should align with the bottom of the nose. A lot of times the bottom of the lobe will align with the top of the lip, but not always. That depends on the individual person, because sometimes earlobes don't hang. A lot of times they're just attached. Okay, so now that we have the major tenets roughed in, let's go ahead and hide the guide layer, and we can even hide that reference layer there. And we've got a pretty good basic rough out of the portrait head. We still need to add some hair to it though. So that's just really rough, just sort of sketching in the hair really quickly, because ultimately we'll end up using that hair brush to generate that. So at this point, let's go ahead and start tightening things up and adding a better details layer. And grab our pencil and start layering in a lot of those details. So here I've created more depth to the eye, just drawn in that iris and the pupil, and used the eraser to pull out that highlight. And I've also tightened up the lines, the curves around the nose and the top lip here. Added the shading for the nostril, just sort of indicated that. And then the wing of the nose, again, I've just indicated that with a slight curve, shaded in a little bit of the lips. Okay, so here's after adding in just a little bit of faint shading, just to sort of indicate some of the shadows of the elements. I've got the darker area underneath the chin. I'm indicating the shape of the nose, a little bit of the form of the cheek, and the shadows within the ear, which is going to be mostly obscured by the hair. And speaking of the hair, we should probably go ahead and get started on doing some of that. Okay, the hair is done using the same technique that I used before on the front portrait. Just use that hairbrush and shaded it in, then use the eraser, and actually I did it really quickly on this one just to see what it's like if it's just sort of sketched in there and not carefully articulated in, because I did want this portrait to be more of a quicker one that's not quite so meticulous, but still captures the shape and the form of the profile portrait. So we're not quite there yet. I think we still need to add a little bit of shading. So let's go ahead and pick our tool Pencil tool, bring that down, and start working on some of that. Okay, so here we have our shading element done in the exact same way as we've done before, just not quite as detailed. Now, the entire point of this exercise is to just show how to start developing a profile portrait. I'm not going to go through every step like I did with the front view one, because you can use all those same lessons on how to bring each of those elements to a full detailed completion. You can use those over here too. It was important to show how to develop the framework to start building a side view portrait on. Alright guys, that's it for the portrait view. Be sure to grab the next lesson, which is lesson 11, where we will tackle the 3/4 view, the most common portrait view. It's also one of the most challenging.